And thanks to Thomas for kicking this off. Thomas created the YUI project 4 years ago, and he's the one that administratively makes all of this possible. He also writes a bunch of the code, so he does double duty. I'm going to talk primarily about YUI 3 today, but I wanted to give you just a quick reminder of where we've come from over really the past 4 years. We started this project in 2005. Thomas started writing code in early 2005, and we released the product internally. We debuted the product externally for the first time in February of 2006. And we versioned things differently back in those days. We had a different numbering scheme internally than we did externally. So you see a little bit of variation there with the 0.10 release and switching over the following year in 2007. We switched over to the 2x nomenclature. So that code line that we know today as YUI 2 started as a public release in 2006. We started working on YUI 3 2 years ago. We've been working on it for a couple of years. We've issued a couple of preview releases, which hopefully you had a chance to play around with. We've also been using it internally for the better part of a year now as we develop the new Yahoo homepage. Over the course of those years, we've also introduced some other aspects to the project. So not just the JavaScript and CSS code lines that are probably the most well-known parts, but also YUI compressor, which came out in 2007. We released the YUI doc project that Adam Moore wrote for API documentation. We have a PHP loader tool. So various parts we've been introducing along the way. The project itself now consists of, as I said, the YUI 2 code line, which is very familiar, I think, to most people. YUI 3, which is the focus of most of our attention this week. YUI compressor, one of the best minification tools out there, if not the best, extremely well-known and popular. YUI doc can be used to generate API documentation. We use it for YUI. It can also be used to document Python, PHP, a variety of other languages. The PHP loader is a flexible and generic tool for loading modular dependencies in JavaScript and CSS. So we ship it with YUI metadata for both YUI 2 and YUI 3, but across Yahoo for the past several years, a lot of groups have used it to package their own modules and include their own JavaScript and CSS on the page. So generic tool, part of the YUI project, ships with YUI 2 and 3 metadata, but you can use it for your own stuff as well. It also includes a combo handler. So if you wanted to move off the Yahoo CDN for some reason, but you still wanted to keep combo handling, PHP Loader is a good tool for that. As we moved to GitHub at the beginning of this year, we also started releasing our build scripts that we use to build our projects from source. Some of those are going to be of interest to you. They're of interest not just if you're contributing to YUI and you need to build your own components, but they're probably of interest as you build your own end-to-end solutions in your own applications. YUI test is another increasingly popular aspect of the YUI project. Right now there's a version that ships with YUI 2 and a version that ships with YUI 3. One of the points I wanted to make this morning was YUI test can be used to test any JavaScript code, certainly not limited to YUI, and there really isn't a tight coupling between YUI test and YUI. So any project that you're working on that you want to do JavaScript unit tests for, YUI test is a good solution for that. An interesting offshoot and something we never really thought deeply about originally that's an important part of the project now is the library of videos that we have up on YUI Theater. A lot of people who we see at conferences know some of the faces, Dave Glass, Douglas Crockford, a lot of the people that have been on YUI Theater just from seeing the videos. And I'm sure we'll get a bunch more videos on YUI Theater this week with all the great talks. Finally, hopefully you've had a chance to see the YUILibrary.com website. This is increasingly an important aspect of our investment in the community. It's a community platform. It includes bug tracking, developer dashboards, forums. It ties together all the identity components. There's a new tab up there along the top that you probably haven't seen before, and we'll be talking about that just a little bit at the end of the talk this morning and then a little bit more later in the conference. So I'm going to break off now and focus on YUI 3, but Stephen will be talking about YUI doc later in the conference. Chad Auld drove our our open source release of PHP Loader. He'll be talking about PHP Loader this week. Ron Adams is here from Yahoo in Southern California. He'll be talking about end-to-end testing with YUI Test, integrating with Selenium. So lots of coverage about other stuff in the project as we move forward. And now we'll just zoom in and focus on the YUI 3 code line. YUI 3 right now contains a great core that's at production quality. So the YUI object, the node object, the event utility. It has a full suite of utilities, most of which are also at production quality. We have a few that we're reserving the beta tag on just because they haven't been exercised deeply enough yet. But most of this kit now is production quality. Whoops. So we have a widget base that right now is in the beta stage. We'll be talking more about this at the conference. The widget foundation is really important. We have some unfinished business with that, but the widget foundation should be in production quality Q1 next year. We'll have some beta widgets shipping on top of that Q1 next year. And as 2010 rolls out, we'll be working on additional widgets to flesh out the YUI 3 system. We also have a set of developer tools. So YUI Test I mentioned and Profiler. The console is there. The CSS system that you're familiar with from YUI 2 is also present in YUI 3. The one notable exception to that is the grid kit. We have not brought YUI grids 2 into the YUI 3 code line yet. I'm not going to go into deeply the reasons for that today. I encourage you to come to the town hall tonight if you have questions about what we're thinking in that regard. Matt Sweeney's the guy who's thinking deeply about CSS for us. He can give you some of his latest thinking about where grids are. The thing I do want everybody to know is that the YUI 2 grid kit works perfectly well with YUI 3. There's no real coupling there with YUI 2 and YUI 3. So it's a product we still care about. Right now, the grid kit resides in YUI 2. So I'm going to do two things this morning. I want to talk about some first concepts, some things that are just essential for understanding YUI 3 and the whole paradigm that comes along with this code line. And then we get the question a lot, why a new code line? What were the driving factors behind YUI 3? I just want to go through 7 key points that drove us to make the decision to create a new code line and things that we think are real value differentiators for YUI 3 today. So I'm going to start out with just a quick tour of some first concepts that are important. The first point and the first thing you touch when you start using YUI 3 is you need to put the YUI global on the page. The same way that you have the Yahoo global in YUI 2, the YUI global is the starting point for everything in YUI 3's JavaScript world. And there's really 3 ways of getting this on the page. 2 of them we would classify as using a seed file. So I want to talk about the 2 different seed file strategies that we have. The first one involves using the YUI object itself plus the loader utility. And together those weigh about 11K on the wire. And with the YUI object and loader, you're always just one HTTP request away from completing any implementation of a YUI 3 project. So loader knows all the dependencies. It knows where all the files live. It'll package together one combo URL and bring everything in. If 11.2K is too much, if you really want to bake it down to a skinnier seed file, you have another option. You can use just the YUI object. The YUI object's a little more than half that size. It's about 6K. And it doesn't know all the dependencies. So the first thing that the YUI object will do when you say, hey, I want to make use of YUI 3 on the page, it'll need to go and bootstrap the loader and bring in all the metadata in the loader utility. And then it can bring in, with the second HTTP request, it can bring in any combination of modules that you need. So there's really 2 seed files, and it's a question of whether you're really sensitive to that initial payload or whether you're more sensitive to that extra HTTP request later in the life cycle. I said there's 3 ways to put this on the page. The third way is really the same way you do it today in YUI 2 if you're not using the YUI 2 loader, which is to create a combo URL with some subset or the full set of modules that you're going to put on the page. And if you're going to do that, really the best way to do this is to go to the YUI3 website, go to the dependency configurator, and you can explore the modules and submodules, get a sense. There's some metadata exposed about what they do and gives you some advice about what to use. The combo URL will be in the top left, and we'll give you some feedback along the top in those tabs about what the page weight is for the decisions that you're making. So that's the best way to do that third loading strategy. So that's getting YUI on the page. So another first concept here has to do with the life cycle of YUI3 once you're making use of it on a page. So let's say the YUI global in some shape or form is on the page now. There's a set of files that can come in to YUI from the Yahoo CDN or from your own deployment of YUI3. And these come in during what we call the add phase. One of the interesting things about YUI3 is that all of these modules that you're familiar with, drag and drop, animation, I/O, these can all come in any order. And they can come in any state of completion. You can bring in an incomplete subset, but an essential subset of the things that you want on the page. Their dependencies don't need to be present for them to be there. They can just sort of come in any order and in any combination. They add themselves, they register with YUI, and the YUI global knows what's there already on the page. So there's all the stuff that YUI knows about intrinsically. And then there's this category of custom code that might be coming in from your own server. It might be coming in for a project that you've put together that's based on YUI3. And those modules can, just like anything that's intrinsic to the library, those modules can come in, register themselves with the YUI global, tell YUI what their dependencies are, and they can be there in the add phase whether or not their dependency list is complete. And so that's kind of how the add phase works. It's order independent, very modular. And then we move at any time to the use phase. And the use phase is when you say, OK, I'm ready to use YUI, and I'm going to create a YUI3 instance on the page. So we'll go through three scenarios here. The first scenario is that we're going to use the image loader utility. The image loader utility depends on, I think, OOP, node, and event. So the first thing the loader would do when it saw this use statement is it would say, are all the dependencies met? And it would say, well, 3 of the 4 are, but the image loader object itself isn't there. So let me go and add that. It'll go and bootstrap that, bring it into the page. And now all the dependencies are there. And so it'll bind in the correct order all of the necessary modules to this particular instance, given what its requirements are. And now we have a self-sufficient YUI instance on the page. And it's sandboxed, it's protected, it's no longer dependent on anything else on the page. A second scenario. Now we want to use that my module that's not part of YUI, but it was added during the add phase. It registered with the YUI object. The loader is going to do the exact same thing. It's going to look at my module, look at what my module said its requirements were, and it's going to go and load all of those requirements onto the page. And then it'll go through and bind one by one in the correct order all of those dependencies onto that instance. And now that second instance, again, sandboxed and independent. There's a third scenario that's important, and that's where there's a module that hasn't been added to the page. It hasn't gone through an add phase, and YUI doesn't know about it. And we want to use it directly from the use statement. So that's also totally transparent to do. In the YUI constructor, you pass in the parameter defining any additional modules that you want to be part of that instance. YUI is going to do exactly the same thing. It's going to say, OK, I have a new module. Need to reconcile that with my dependency logic. It'll go through, add all the stuff that is in part of YUI that's a dependency, and it'll add your custom module wherever that may be coming from. And then it'll go through that process of binding everything in order. And now we have 3 instances on the page, all separate, all with their own requirements. As you can imagine, this is really good for modular development. It's also really good for the way we work, typically in the modern world of development. It's hard to emphasize how many times this has come across our desk at YUI, where something later in the life cycle of a page affects something in the YUI ecosystem that then goes and breaks an implementation on the page. That doesn't happen with YUI3. These instances are still functioning. the things that happen within these modules don't affect one another. So there's really good isolation, making for a very robust environment for you to deploy modular code. So that's a really important first concept with YUI 3. I want to drill in now to another concept that's a little bit different with YUI 3 versus YUI 2. In the YUI 2 world, you're familiar with, and probably other JavaScript paradigms, you're familiar with this idea of modularity. And YUI 2, very a la carte. All the modules, you can pick which modules you want, bring in their dependencies. In the YUI 3 world, we've taken that a little bit further. So what we're going to do in YUI 3 is take a module like the I/O module, which is the connection manager, the XHR functionality from YUI 2. And we're going to say modularity is good, but submodularity is better. Instead of just grouping together all of the features related to one particular module, we're going to break out different features and feature sets and let you choose those a la carte. So with I/O, in many, many cases, probably even more than 80/20, all you're doing is XHR. All you're doing is a simple XHR request. And if that's all you're doing, that little blue chunk on the left of the graph, that's the only piece you need to bring in. You bring in what we call the I/O base submodule, and that's it. And you leave the rest on the table. And the good news is if you really did want the form handling, you can bring that in, and you just get that little sliver of code. So you're getting feature-specific granularity in the code that you put on the page. This is really important. As you carry this across increasingly complex applications, the potential for savings in code and performance is really great. I'm going to just give you a couple of other pictures without going super deep into this. Drag and drop. Drag and drop has more functionality in 3. It's more powerful in 3. But if all you're doing is putting the functionality on the page where you want to be able to move something around, it is much, much smaller than it was in 2 because of this submodular packaging. Matt's been working on the animation utility. Again, most animations are very straightforward, would just require the anim base submodule, which is the yellow piece on the left, a little bit more than half the size that it was in YUI 2. So this is really good news. I'll give you one more picture, and I just put this up here because it's such a poster child for submodularity. The data source component that Jenny works on, you're almost always just using one kind of data source. And so it sets up very perfectly for a submodular structure where you select the features you want out of data source, the specific data source you want, the specific type of schema you want. The overall size of this graph is a little bit skewed because I didn't include everything that's in YUI 2 versus YUI 3. It's a little bit apples to oranges, but the submodularity and that fine choice that you have over how much code is on your page is really important, and it's really bearing out well in YUI 3. So I want to move on now from those basic concepts of YUI 3 and talk about the 7 key drivers that we think differentiate YUI 3 from its predecessor and differentiate it from potentially from other things out there on the market. And you can track our progress here as we go down the left. The first thing I want to talk about is familiar conventions and idioms. YUI 3 is syntactically very different than YUI 2. We believe it's much more learnable, much more friendly, and we're having a much better time coding it. And I know that's a very subjective thing to say, but we're really enjoying just the process of writing code. And here's why we think that's the case. When all of us in this room look at a web page, we see a bunch of nodes, we see a bunch of potential events that could happen on those nodes, and we see what we would do as programmers to respond to those events. So we break it down in our heads immediately. There's HTML elements that we care about, there's DOM events that we can subscribe to, and there are event objects that are emitted from those interactions. And those are the things that interest us as developers. Those are our principal hooks into the world of web programming. What we struggle with as developers is all those things are different across browsers. The way elements are exposed and their properties and methods operate different in different browsers. The way we subscribe to DOM events is still different across some of the browsers that we care about. Event objects have eccentricities in the different browsers. So what we do in YUI 3 is we give you a very familiar paradigm. Instead of working with HTML elements, you're going to work with something that's going to feel a lot like that. We call it a node object. You're going to subscribe to events much as you did in YUI2 with the event utility, but with one consistent interface. And when there's an event that transpires, we're going to emit an event facade that's going to feel a lot like a DOM event. So there's going to be a familiarity as you start looking at YUI code. And here's some expressions of that familiarity. If you're using a node object, you go out and get the node object by using a selector. So here's another, this probably should have been a first concept. YUI3 is selector driven in a way that YUI2 wasn't. Selectors were kind of a la carte in YUI2. You get this node object foo, and if it's a form element, you can call focus on it just like you would with a standard DOM element. And in fact, we'll just pass through directly to DOM methods where the DOM methods work and do what they're supposed to do. But we can also fix the methods that are broken, and we can add new methods like add class to add a non-duplicative class assignment to a given element. So this kind of syntax should feel very familiar to you as a front-end engineer, and it allows you to make that transition to YUI3 without, there are new idioms in any library, of course, but the fundamental idioms here are ones that I think you're going to find very familiar. Moving on to events, whoops, moving back to event. So if we put node and event in our use statement, again, you can go out and get that foo node, and then you can subscribe to the event directly on the node. So foo.on gives you the ability to subscribe to an event. And you can also, if you don't have to have a node reference on hand, you can say y.on and subscribe to the reference that way. And this is going to be consistent throughout the event stack. You're going to see the same signature, the same patterns for subscribing to custom events and DOM events. And when we emit this event facade and your event handler is processing a DOM event, you're going to just see exactly the same methods and properties that you're used to. The difference is that they're going to work. So if you're just using the DOM events, you have eccentricities you have to worry about. The YUI3 methods, they don't have eccentricities. And we can do a little bit more because we're doing it this way. We can take something like stop immediate propagation, which is a forward-looking standard, and it's not something that's been implemented in all the browsers. We can implement that in YUI3 to stop all future action as a result of this event. That's not something we even could have done really in YUI2, but the architecture of YUI3 allows us to do it. And it allows us to put in sugar methods like halt to do both prevent default and stop immediate propagation or stop propagation. So we think that idiomatically YUI3 really sets up the way we think as front-end engineers. And that's one of the big objectives that we had. I've talked a little bit about lazy loading already, but it's really important. Lazy loading as an intrinsic assumption and pattern within the library is really different. It's a very different assumption to start with when you're writing code. That may not be the best example. When you come to a modern web application like the the Yahoo homepage, this is really a lot of applications on this page. The search box is a search assist driven application with a lot of complexity. All of the things down the left rail now are different applications that link out to different services. It's hard, if you're building a page like this, it's hard to know what the user's going to do when they come to the page. And the best thing to do is to try not to guess. The best thing to do is to put on the page all of the functionality you need to get started, but then let the application respond to the user's needs. And lazy loading being intrinsically built into the library allows you to do that. So the principle here is one page. Really, it's comprised of many applications. You don't know how many. You may be writing one module and not know what other modules are going to be on the page with it. You want a library that starts with a seed, or is at least very conducive to that pattern that starts with a seed and grows out from that as the page life cycle goes on. And you want a library that supports that model of development where the user's actions drive the responses of the code. And as we talked about, the first principles in YUI3 really are conducive to that kind of assumption, that kind of development. There's another reason why this is better and potentially more performant for you. If you go back 5 years, this is probably how you were writing code. It's how many of us were writing code. If you had multiple modules on the page, You probably included a script tag for each module. If you were way ahead of your time, you maybe were aggregating your files, but the religion of performance didn't come into vogue quite that early. And what would happen in the modern browsers and some of the non-modern browsers that we still rely on is that the browser would get to each one of those script tags and just stop everything it's doing until that script tag loaded. If you move to the YUI3 model, you don't have to necessarily be concatenating your files. You just go to this use statement pattern. And what's going to happen is, just by the nature of the way the loader works, those files are going to move into parallel loading simply because they're being loaded via script nodes. So this idea of doing modular development in YUI3 has intrinsic performance benefits in addition to all the benefits that we've already talked about in terms of modularity and sandboxing. There's some professional patterns that we think are baked into YUI3 that you're going to find to be conducive to the kind of work you want to do. We'll talk about sort of 3 or 4 of these. One of them is actually just the most simple thing in YUI3, which is the function callback for a use statement. If you have something that's going to execute just once on a page, when you do a YUI use statement, the callback that's fired passing you your YUI instance when all your dependency tree is complete provides a really nice pattern for just sticking in an anonymous function, gives you the kind of the global variable protection if you choose to use it. This pattern, many of our developers are seeing as we're building sites, is actually just a great pattern in and of itself to use for the simplest things on a page. I've talked a little bit already about reuse. We totally encourage you to use the same patterns we're using as you develop modular reusable code that's based on YUI3. Use the add statement to register your modules with the page so that you can then include them in multiple use statements throughout your application. And we talked about all the benefits. You get all the benefits natively that all the YUI modules get in terms of order independence, in terms of sandboxing, in terms of being able to be bound to multiple YUI instances on the page. So take use of that top right corner there of extending the library and making it your own. I want to cover one other aspect to the way we're patterning code in YUI3. It's a little bit different. So if we go back in time to the way YUI2 was architected, if we were building something like an overlay, we'd make a list of all the functionality that we thought belonged in an overlay object, and we'd bake that into this base class. And then we'd start looking and saying, okay, well, tooltip needs a lot of what an overlay has, so that's going to inherit from overlay. And a panel needs a lot of what an overlay has, so that's going to inherit. And a dialog is just a panel, really. And then a simple dialog is just kind of a simpler version of dialog. And you end up with a class hierarchy in which a tooltip ends up with a lot of functionality, which is great, but it ends up with some functionality that you might never want in a tooltip. And that's not great. And so these instances end up having a lot of baggage with them. What we've done in YUI3 is we've kind of exploded that whole pattern and kind of started over in our thinking. All of these pieces of functionality now are broken out into reusable modules of code. And where we have reusable modules of code that we think should be used to augment a class like tooltip or overlay, we call those extensions. And where those reusable modules of code should be augmenting a specific instance on the page, we call them plugins. And the architecture for creating these is fully exposed to you. We think this is a great pattern for you to use in writing your own code. What you'll find then is that a tooltip can be composed of just the extensions that make sense for it. And an overlay obviously might share some of those, but it might use some different ones as well. And then instances of these could draw from the plugin pool and be supplemented with whatever plugins are available. We think that gives you the best possible set of choices in terms of preventing you from bringing code onto the page that you don't need, but still allowing every instance of every object to be fully empowered to do what you need it to do. You can imagine there's a lot we could say about all these patterns. I'm not going to cover all of this morning, clearly, but Isaac will be talking about solving problems with YUI3 during the conference. Eric Miraglia traveled all the way from Boston to talk to you about web app development with YUI3, cover some of this ground. And Carity is here from the East Coast. He'll be talking to you about building custom modules, so populating that top right corner with your own YUI3 content. So lots of opportunities to drill in as we go through the next 2 days. I've already talked about sandboxes a little bit, so I'm just going to quickly reiterate that modern web applications are web pages that within them have lots of little applications. So even the search box in the top right corner might be its own application. And the YUI3 paradigm is ideally suited to help you deal with this challenge because every one of these modules is likely to be a YUI instance and give you that insulation from everything else that's going on the page. So YUI3 is a really good way to do sandboxing to protect your code from other things that may be happening on the page concurrently with it. We all know that as the number of developers goes up and the amount of time that a project lives goes up, the potential for disaster also goes up. YUI3 is designed from the ground up to help mitigate that trend, right? You're going to be writing modules today that are going to be living on a page somebody else composed 3 years from now. And YUI3, we think, is a great foundation for making your code very durable over time. The event system is actually something that we're extremely proud of in YUI3. We think it's one of the biggest reasons to use YUI3. And it's one of the things I'm going to spend the least amount of time on this morning. We've already talked a little bit about the familiar conventions. I haven't said, and should say, the great synthetic events that Atom provides in the event utility are also important. DOM ready to let you know that you can do stuff to the page in IE without getting an operation aborted error. Unavailable, letting you know that an element's now ready on the page. Content ready tells you that an element is not just available, but all of its children are available. Those synthetic events are all present and accounted for in YUI3. And a fantastic custom event system. It looks and feels a lot like the DOM event system, so it's very easy to learn, very familiar. It has stop propagation, prevent default, all the granularity, aspect-oriented programming that you'd want. So super powerful event system. And Luke will be talking in depth about the event system, so I don't have to, which is great. So we can move on to other stuff. Luke is the guy on the right. I don't know if that makes you more or less eager to go to the top. There's a whole basket of pro features in YUI3 that we're excited about. I'm going to talk about this particular list very quickly, and I'll point you out to the talks later in the conference that will give you more information about these. The attribute system in YUI3 is incredibly easy to use, very easy to make any object have attributes that are settable. Having just the ability to provide validators, to massage input on the front end and on the back end, to be able to serialize state easily. These are things that any professional web developer kit should have. YUI3, we think, has a really good attribute system. It grows out of what we had in YUI2, but is better in a couple of key ways. It allows you to keep the DOM separate as the view of what's going on and have really your data about the state of your application separate. There will be a talk that Satyen's doing, I'll plug in a moment, that goes more deeply into that. I've already talked about the event system as much as I'm going to. We're very proud of events. Definitely check out Luke's talk later in the conference. Object-oriented programming. I talked a little bit about the way we're thinking differently about our patterns. But regardless of what we're doing, you're going to want a full suite of class management utilities in your library. And they're all there in YUI3. If you want to do traditional class hierarchies, Y.extend is there to allow you to build those vertical hierarchies and manage your code that way. As I said before, we're finding ourselves more and more just using augmentation. So Y.augment, bringing functionality from, say, the event library onto an object, bringing functionality from the attribute system, for example. That's how easy it is to put attributes on an object. I mean, it's just super easy to do this stuff in YUI3. Really nice pro touches in YUI3, like event delegation. We've talked about event delegation for years, And we've just recently built it into both code lines in YUI. Event delegation, if you're not familiar with it, is this concept that you have a DOM structure, and what you really want to know is you want to know, in this case, any li is clicked on, you want to know about it. And you want to avoid having to hook up n event listeners to do that. Maybe you don't know how many LIs are going to be there in any case, and that could be a dynamic list. Event delegation allows you to do that. So we have an event delegate module. You call y.delegate. You can respond to the event. And you designate what the event delegate is. This is the top level DOM element that's going to capture all those events. And then you can specify what particular DOM element type you want to be listening to the events on. And it's that easy to do event delegation. So baking these performance touches into the library. And once you do that, of course, you're just going to get that kind of nice bubbling. If any li is clicked on, it's going to bubble up, and you're going to capture that event at the top level. We have some great accessibility features hooked into the library. Some of them you're going to get for free, like listening for focus and blur, events that are problematic to deal with in some ways because they don't bubble the way you'd expect in all browsers. And we just correct that under the hood for you. Applying ARIA is really easy in YUI 3. It's easier than it's ever been in the YUI stack. Obviously, we could spend an hour on this. In fact, we will spend an hour on it later in the conference. Todd will be talking about how you can make accessibility an assumption for all the code you write, and how YUI 3 makes that not an afterthought, but just something that's so easy that you'd never think not to do it. Sorry, we talked about plugins and extensions earlier. This is important for professional web development in general. We think having a library that's kind of living this creed and giving you some patterns to follow is going to make it easier for all of us to share code and kind of build code in this way. Satyen's been working hard on the component infrastructure. He'll talk about this later in the conference. But the idea that we have base components for utilities and then kind of going up to the widget level that manage all aspects of the life cycle of a component, consistent init phase, consistent destructors. These are going to be consistent ways, too, for us to extract state from an object. These are really nice features as you start building code that more than just one developer has to care about. And again, Satyen will be talking in depth about this in his widget walkthrough talk later in the conference. Documentation has been one of the pro features that we've always focused on in YUI. You can love or hate documentation, and sometimes there can be a lot of documentation, and that's not always the best thing. Having just the piece you want is the right thing. We work really hard on it. All of our engineers write the documentation ourselves, and it's a huge challenge to do well. We see a lot of room for improvement, but the fact of the matter is it's a super well-documented library. As you go and look at our users' guides, they aren't just superficial. We really dive in and give you, as much as we can, a deep dive into how the code works. We try to give you a full example suite with each component. And a lot of these examples are actually tutorials. They're not just, click here, hello world. They give you a lot of content. API documentation. Again, this is really hard to do well, and YUI doc has helped us a lot in this regard. But this ability to not just present the whole API, but if you want to find event targets fire method, you're always just a few keystrokes away from doing that in the API documentation. So that's a plug not just for our API docs, but this is how good your API docs ought to look as well if you're using YUI doc. We have a great community. The YUI community has been thriving over the last 4 years. And it's really just changing the way the library looks, feels, and operates. Increasingly, it's going to change the way you use code. More of it's going to come from the community as time goes on. A couple of bullet points. We've been doing it for 4 years. The library's been downloaded way more than 1 million times. We've moved around from SourceForge to other places. So it's a little hard to track a clear number there. But tens of thousands of developers using this. 15,000 of them are registered in one form or another. And we have a great, very active IRC channel. Just rounding up these pro features, 2 more of them. A consistent BSD license. Very liberal license, applies to everything in YUI. That's a big deal. You want to know that you can use anything in the library and not get in trouble with the lawyers. YUI gives you that peace of mind. And the global CDN is a huge advantage with YUI as well. Yahoo serves the code. This is the same architecture that we use to serve stuff at Yahoo. So you know if your application's having a problem because our CDN is down, Yahoo's having a problem, and we're doing something about it. This is the last thing I want to talk about this morning, and we'll move on to a coffee break here. This is a big deal, and this is sort of the big announcement that we have for this morning. YUI's strength for a long time has been a great core development team. And for the first couple of years of the project, the core development team did all of the development. The reason for that really had to do with legal restrictions that we had in terms of accepting external code. And what that meant was we fell into a pattern in the first few years of the project where the engineers you see talking at this conference and you see around the room today were doing the code, and members of the community were contributing bug reports and feature requests, in some cases patches. But that was the model that we fell into. And this year, as we've been starting to accept contributions, we've blown that out of the water. This guy you know is Satyam, if you are a member of the YUI community. He's a retiree on the Mediterranean coast. He knows more about data table, I think, than a lot of us do on the team, certainly more than a lot of us do. He contributed one of the headline features of the YUI 2.8 release last month. Guys, I see sitting in the audience this morning, Matt Snyder from Mint, contributed an incredibly important new component in that 2.8 release, the client-side storage utility. Fantastic component, very well received. Those were the two most important things in the library in 2.8. They both came from outside of Yahoo. And we love that release. That's it's our favorite thing about this year has been the fact that we've had these great external contributions. And one thing that we've all realized on the YUI team is that it's just not nearly enough. We're not anywhere close to where we want to be. So this morning, we're happy to announce that we're changing the model and breaking down the core core throttle that's applied to YUI. Yahoo engineers are still going to contribute directly to the core, and we're still going to work every day on making this the core of the library better. But we're adding a new concept this morning called the YUI gallery. The YUI gallery is properly to be considered part of YUI. But it's really open for contributions from third parties without any real overhead on the part of the YUI team. You don't need to wait for a release to go out. You don't need to wait for extensive code reviews. This is something that can just grow organically over time. In fact, it's such a great mechanism that we're going to start using it as well. The YUI engineers, Yahoo engineers, are going to be contributing to it as well. And the best content from Gallery will end up potentially becoming part of the core library. But I think you'll find as we get into this that it doesn't even need to. You can use it directly from Gallery. This is how it's going to work. As a developer, you can contribute a module to the Gallery database to let the community know that you've got this YUI 3-based module that you want to share. And that's the only, you just need to be a registered member of YUILibrary.com to do this. That's all. That's the only restriction there. If you want it to be really easy for the community to use and discover and make use of our CDN, you'll need to sign a CLA and be willing to, just as with any YUI contribution, make the contribution under our BSD license, because that consistent license is really important. If you're willing to do that, you'll commit your project to the YUI 3 Gallery repository on GitHub. We're planning to do this about 30 times a year. We'll do a light review, not to make sure that your code is doing what you think it's doing, but simply to make sure that it meets minimum standards of friendliness, that we don't see anything dangerous there. And we'll push it out to the CDN. And once it's on the CDN, so figure every couple of weeks we'll be doing that, Gallery modules will be able to be used by all of us in this room, anybody around the world using YUI 3, directly from the use statement. They'll be first-class citizens, able to be combo handled directly from the CDN along with everything else. It'll look something like this. At least this is what it's going to look like as we release it this week. You'll see in the gallery module a description of the use statement that you need to put in defining the gallery module. You'll include the gallery module in your use statement, and then you'll be able to make use of it directly in your use callback. So this isn't something that we're announcing and telling you will be available at some point. It's available today, actually available yesterday. And here are some of the things that are in it as it launches. Some really fun stuff. This one actually isn't there yet, right, Dave? Not yet. You'll like it. I should have deleted it from the slide. It's coming. We've seen it. It's very cool. But there's a bunch of stuff in there already. Your stuff can be in there next week if you want it to be. It's that easy to use. That was the graphic that goes with that statement. Dave's not wearing his YUI Redneck t-shirt today, but it would be very appropriate because a month ago the gallery was on our whiteboard, and Dave made this thing happen. We knew what we wanted to do, and Dave committed to getting it done for the conference, and it's a remarkable feat that he did get it done. It's there. It's working today. Dave, congratulations on banging that out. And the t-shirt's available on Zazzle. I think if you probably go to Yahoo search and search for YUI Redneck, you'll find a reference to it. And this is actually the slide plugging Dave's talk, so I didn't give you enough information to make use of this, but Dave will take you through the whole process of putting your modules on YUI Gallery. This is going to be big. It'll change a lot of the way we experience YUI 3. And we're as excited about this as we've been about anything all year. That's really what I wanted to cover this morning. We talked about kind of the first concepts with YUI. We talked about the 7 reasons that drove us to do a new code line. We think we're there with YUI 3 in terms of having something that where you're building a project and you don't need data table, you don't need rich text editor. YUI 3 is a better choice now. It's out, production quality, there for you to use. Can't wait to get your feedback. I think there's about 14 other good reasons why YUI 3 is a good choice, and they're all around the room today. They're presenting throughout the next 2 days. You're going to get a chance to meet them, ask them questions. They're fantastic people to work with. They're brilliant engineers and just really fun people to show up to work with every day. So I hope you have a chance to meet all of them over the next 2 days. Enjoy the conference. Thanks again for getting up early, 9:15, to come this morning. We're thrilled to have you. And we look forward to 2 great days.